drawing on common sense. A professorial cafe, I would say. I would gesture that it's possibly more of a cafe than a lecture, which is great, because I actually wanted to create it like a teaching session with students, and maybe that's my comfort zone. And that's actually the first bit I want to take you through, really, because it does figure large through the research that I'm going to talk about later. The pedagogy, the teaching, which is so important to me, and actually that interplay between teaching and research and teaching, and artist and teacher and artist, and the interplay between those two things is really critical, I think, in the way I've thought about my interest, my practice, my research, and so forth. Of course, we can't talk about that without thinking about this guy, Joseph Beuys. It's my most important function. To be a teacher is my greatest work of art. And I think that has actually followed me through my career, really, by and large, as a really important motif. That sense of it's about the teaching is the art. And maybe that's why I've ended up where I am today, teaching and working in art schools variously across the country, because that sense of the social sculpture, to use one of Beuy's phrases, ideas, is actually what I think I'm doing here. So enough about Beuys, but that's the powerful call, if you like, that sense of the education is the work of art. And we'll see that later on in the show next week when Paul and I talk about teaching for our time, I think, as well. So that's a really important part of it. I've put students through some extraordinary experiments in my time. This is just one of them. So they've been variously blinded, tied up in the nicest possible way, put in dark rooms and everything. So what's that about, really? I mean, and that's about a pedagogy which tries to push students and their senses to the edge of where I can possibly be with it. And a realization that the most impactful teaching, and often the most radical teaching, happens when a student finds something within themselves that they didn't know was there. They uncover it, if you like. A suppressed sensory capability becomes revealed to them. So in this workshop, for instance, which actually was in Falmouth, I have to say, in Falmouth. They're doing blind drawings, and they're creating blind drawings. You can see them around on the walls and so forth. And that sense of a student finding that bit of practice, that as a workshop, and finding that they're making drawings that are more meaningful to them than when they can see, and that they have much more efficacy and interest to them than the drawings they make just by representing what they can see in front of them. So this one was here. So this is, as a brief background for those who don't know, I arrived to lead the painting, drawing, printmaking degree course and set that up. So this is sort of early days of churning through colour theory and all of that stuff in terms of the teaching, how to teach first years about painting, drawing and printmaking. So again, colour psychology was another really important aspect of it. It opens a perceptual door in the student which never closes. And an example here might be, for instance, an exercise in simultaneous contrast, for instance, where each one of those squares is the same grey, but depending on which colour it's associated with, it appears to take on the complementary colour to which it's associated. So the red will take on the green, the blue, the orange. So there are some ex-students in here. I can see they're going, yeah, shut up. The point of showing you this is that this is a perceptual door that opens, and when you stare at a red square on a white sheet of paper and you look away to a white sheet of paper and you see a green, phantasm almost of a square in front of your eyes, it's extraordinary. It moves people. It moves students into another space. It really, really does. So that, and I suppose somebody said, are you going to be a magician today? And I think, well, there's a bit of legerdemain possibly in my approach this afternoon. But it's always seemed that slightly performative aspect of teaching, that look at this because this might move you, is part of the function of being a teacher. A teacher for me is someone who gestures towards something. Not someone who tries to fill someone with information, but normally, for me, it's about, look over there. I think something interesting is happening over there. And that's that's the profound act of pedagogy for me. Okay, so the other, and I'm going to do a bit of fast action geometry right now, so bear with me. Okay, so the other bit of a really interesting hidden aspect of it, because I think this is what I'm always trying to push towards with the pedagogy, is uncovering the hidden aspects or the hidden orders or the natural laws which are around us. So it's this thing, which you might have come across, which is the golden ratio. Artists in the room will be very aware of that, others maybe not so much. So this is a ratio which, if you like, sings through the world. It's a frequency which is throughout nature and us and everything around us. And it's a sort of realization from a student perspective that this thing exists around us. It's a kind of a resonance through it that runs right through the world. It's something that for them with their art practice, initially certainly, which seems very confusing, full of creative failure, and what am I going to do, what am I going to paint, what's the point of it, suddenly aligns them to a function or a natural law, which is like a lifebelt in a great sea of uncertainty, i.e. the art world and what their place might be in it. It acts like a lifebelt. So what I'm going to do now does make sense later on, but it is a bit of it's me being the teacher. I've got a piece of chalk in my hand, oh my God. So this, I'm going to explain what it is. So these blackboards are golden rectangles. They're based on the measurements of the golden mean. It's derived from the Fibonacci series. The Fibonacci series, which was discovered in somewhere like 300 BC, and we've been kind of working on it ever since. What is it? It's a series of numbers where you add the two numbers before to create the next number. So 1, add those two. 2, what's the next number? 3, next. 5, thanks. 8, 13, 21. Okay, we don't need to go any further. That's about as far as we can do mental arithmetic. So it's a series of numbers which goes on infinitely. Now, the interesting thing about the Fibonacci series, it runs through nature, but it's expressed through the golden ratio. How is it expressed through the golden ratio? Because if you divide the larger number by the smaller number, it derives this number, 1.168. Now that clearly doesn't, because that's just half, but as you go further up the Fibonacci series, and certainly as you get towards the bigger numbers, it gets more and more refined. But this number is an irrational number. If I can spell irrational. i.e. it never stops like pi. It goes on and on and on and on. You never get to the end of this integer. So it's a function of a ratio in nature. Now, so how is that natural form expressed? Well, here's one I prepared earlier, because this was too difficult to draw on the fly. I'll be here, for instance, hanging around with rulers and so forth. So this blackboard is a golden rectangle. You might notice that it's quite a satisfying sort of shape, isn't it? You're kind of like, it's got something about it. So if this is a golden rectangle, I put inside that a square into the golden rectangle, so a square which is the same length as the shorter side, so I've made a square. It leaves me with another golden rectangle. And into that I put another square. Leaves me with a golden rectangle. Into that I put another square. It leaves a golden rectangle. Into that I put another square. So it's a bit like the cat in the hat. It keeps going on and on. Until finally you get down to the centre. So we can start putting Fibonacci series in here. We can go 1, 1, can't remember now, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21. And I can keep going out and out like that for a long, long time, in fact, infinitely. So what does that do? Actually, it creates, I do, that. Because I'm taking the points at each point when it runs over the edge of the square, and it creates this incredible exponential spiral, which if you're on the beach and you see one of these, you see expressed completely in nature. And that's a really obvious example of Fibonacci series expressed in nature. Now, some of you might be going, I knew this, I saw that, I've seen this. For a student, it's extraordinary, because suddenly you've got a rule-based system which can inform your art practice, because it informs the human body and the ratio of the human body. We're all sitting here as expressions of a golden mean. So this is a pair of golden mean protractors. I'm getting quite, there we are, look. If you open it up, you can see there's the ratio, yeah? We made these in PDP. We had them, the Fab Lab were making them for us in plastic. You can close it up anywhere you like, and it gives you that ratio. So if I put it on here, you can see, there it is, yeah? So it's in the human body. Closest, the best way of expressing it right now in this company might be to say, okay, in my arm, between my arm and my wrist and the end of my hand, that's the golden ratio. Yeah? And it's all over the body. So from my feet to the top of my head and the navel, that's the point of the intersection of the golden mean. From the navel, the top of my head, underneath my chin, is the golden ratio. And it goes on and on and on like that. Even the way our ears are formed, our function of our face, and so on and so forth. I could put this all over my face and show you all that. I'm not going to do that right now. You can find that out for yourselves if you're interested. For a student who's drawing the figure, wow, suddenly I've got something, and it's just unpacked something for me. So it's not necessarily about the thing itself, although I find it intensely interesting, and this great flux that runs through nature, which is this 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, you know, it goes, it's like a beat. It's seriously interesting to a student who needs to grasp onto something. And you might reflect that, you know, I found something else, when I was doing this research actually, for the talk, I even found out something else, which is, does anyone remember foolscap paper? Foolscap, which is just the watermark, is what we had before A4 paper. For those of you who don't remember it, we now have A4, which is a metric size. Foolscap was actually this. This is like a foolscap blackboard, because foolscap is, and it's fool's cap like that, is 8 inches by 13 inches. What does that remind you of? Oh yeah, 8, 13. So foolscap was part of the Fibonacci series. And I was like, wow, that's so interesting. Because actually, at that point, before the metric system arrived, and I'm not going to say we have to stop being metric or anything, I'm just pointing it out, we had things like foolscap paper, which actually we were more surrounded by the golden mean, or the golden ratio, there's all kinds of different names for it, at that time, as a sort of natural thing that was around us that was naturally beautiful. I'm going to use the word beauty a lot, I think, in this talk. And I think it's underrated, and we don't talk enough about it in the art school. And this is profoundly an art school conversation. This is a Bauhaus conversation. This is what students need to understand, because I'm going to talk about in the conclusion, really, is about where we go with this, is an understanding of the human ratio, the golden mean, how students can unpack their sensorium and be alive to the world. All right, let's move on. Okay, so just hold that in your head. You don't have to, it's on the blackboard in front of you, so it's going to stay there. That sense of something hidden revealed to you as a student, you never forget it. So other kind of workshops we're getting. I actually thought about getting you to doodle while you were doing it, while you were watching the talk. I decided against it because there's other things for you to do. You're not getting away with it entirely. So unconscious doodling, particularly while listening to lectures or sitting anywhere, actually unpacking that sense of that drawing and art making can happen when you're, if you like, you're not intending to make it. Unintentional art is really art which can fail and fall over, but produces the most remarkable images while you're doing it. So while I was teaching, I was also engaged in some of my own art practice, and I think it's fair to say that it's also to do with the hidden aspects of materials, particularly. So in this piece, which was called Bee Vessel Wax Wave, which was in Lausanne in Switzerland, it's 5 vessels which are actually, they're made of cement fondue with a heating pad underneath them that's set inside them with beeswax on a timer, so they're on a cycle. What are they doing? They're melting and solidifying at various points. Why? Because I was really interested in this effect in wax, which is called Faraday crispations or Faraday waves, which is the function of cooling materials have a kind of a wave or a frequency in them, which create these standing waves on the surface. And you can see it very well in beeswax because you get this wave formation, which interestingly is the same each time. It's not random. It stays the same each time. So it's like the material was drawing itself. Again, another hidden aspect or hidden view of a material which we're kind of very used to, but it did this thing. So I created an installation which basically the Faraday wave, the Faraday crispation, was evident at each point. So also for the students, the idea that 5 senses is actually a nonsense. There were 12 senses in the last century, and certainly medical science, medicalized version of the senses, gets us to around about 21 senses, which we have. 5 senses is by no means enough. What were the 12 senses, you ask? I can hear you asking. Hearing, word, thought, ego, taste, smell, balance, movement, life, touch, sight, and warmth were the 12 senses. And you can see the 5 in there interspersed, but the other ones are very much about our sense of how we stand, our kinesthetic sense of how we are in the world, our sense of being alive. So those 12 senses, and really working in the pedagogy with the 12 senses and not the 5 senses just, was really important. And I think I just want to leave this section around the pedagogy with a quote from William Blake: "If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite. For man has closed himself up till he sees all things through narrow chinks of his cavern." Some of you will be aware of that quote. The doors of perception, it's got other meanings in sort of drug culture, but anyway, I'm claiming it back. They're thresholds into new thoughts, new ways of seeing, new ways of comprehending the world. To paraphrase Blake, I suppose, there is a Chinese proverb that says, if you want to know what water is, don't ask a fish. And I think that's that sense of we live so much in the bubble of our own existence that we do not see, and we now cannot see, hence cleansing the doors of perception, what is actually around us. What we carry around with us every day in our waking life. What lives around us, running through nature. The singing of the golden ratio through everything. It's sort of miraculous, and it's wonderful at the same time. And that's what I've been really intent on bringing to students. So there's an aspect here as well around the senses, clearly, and I want to talk about peripheral vision now. And you've got a job to do. And it's important because unless you see it for yourselves, maybe you won't understand what the rest of it's about. So you might have thought this was an SU Christmas decoration, but it is not. It is a prop. So your job now is to, I'm going to carry on talking while you do this. I need you to fix your eyes onto that red dot, that red ball, for 2 minutes. You're not to take your eyes off it. If you feel it in your eyes, you will feel desperate that you want to wrench your eyes away from it. But the idea is that you've got to keep them fixed. Because what I want you to do is start to notice what happens in your the peripherality of your vision, what the effects that start to happen in the outside of your vision. It's quite tough, but I'm going to start you, now, 2 minutes. Keep on it. And just remember what happens. Just be aware. Don't look at it, because it will just go away immediately. Keep looking at the red ball. Keep drinking the Kool-Aid. So this sense of the pedagogy of the senses, to open up this powerful sense of vision in students, which we carry out with us in every waking moment, and the role of the peripheral and unfocused vision in our lived experience of the world, as well as the spaces we inhabit. You should start to see, I'm going to suggest you should start to see the room starting to pulsate. You might see the furniture and the perspectives around it starting to distort. You might start to see the polarity of the room change into negative, flashing backwards and forwards. You might start to see the edges of furniture and objects in the room starting to be lined with white light. Okay, and stop. Okay, that's quite tough, isn't it? It's quite a hard thing to do. It's completely unnatural because of course, our vision is naturally succeeding across the piece, our eyes are dodging around all the time, looking this way and that, finding the edges of objects. We never stare pointedly at one thing. But what happens is, at that point, then the peripheral vision, because you become much more aware of your whole focus. So, our peripheral vision, if we say that is the arc of our vision, is around 185 degrees. It's not exact because people are different. It's between 180 and 190 degrees. Now, I'm not sure we've got quite enough room in here, and you might knock somebody out if you did do it. But if you do it in your own time, and if you've got enough room, you can do it now. If you stick your arms out and just waggle your thumbs, and it comes back in, and you can just see your thumb waggling, that's the edge of your peripheral vision. Yeah? Just there, because peripheral vision is also a motion detector. So it only really sees things that are moving. It's very hard to see things that are still. I'll come to that in a moment. 185 degrees. So that's what we can see. That's what we carry around with us all the time. In our waking life, we carry this big field of vision. Now, what we actually look with, when you were looking at the red ball, you're looking at a field of vision which is around about 4 degrees, thereabouts. That's what's called the central or foveal vision. That's the accurate bit that you can read with, that you can catch a bus with, that you're able to focus on something that's of interest. But of course we repress everything else. We repress this great field of peripheral vision. Is repressed by the brain, by the brain, because it doesn't have to deal with it. It sits there without needing to be. It's what's interesting is that 4 degree piece. What I've been interested in my research is this bit. This bit that's repressed. And we might say, also if you are minded to, you might think about your nose. Some of us got larger noses than others. I have to do more repression than most people. Nonetheless, our nose is a great thing in front of our eyes, which, if you start noticing it's really there, isn't it? It's this great thing. Do we think about it? No. We do not. So there's glasses as well. I think if people who wear glasses, I think there's another thing there. We repress the sense of having a frame attached to the front of our faces, all of that stuff. So I want to propose here that this space of repression, this 181 degrees thereabouts, that the very essence of lived experience is moulded by peripheral and focused vision and touch. And I also want to propose that touch is the fundamental sense that we have in the world. Everything relates to touch. Focused vision, that's that 4 degrees, that's the kind of the bit you read books with, confronts us with the world, whereas peripheral vision envelops us in what I think Merleau-Ponty might call the flesh of the world. Peripheral vision wraps us into the world. Focused vision confronts us with it. So all the senses, including vision, let's say, are functions of the tactile or touch. All the senses are specializations of skin tissue. All sensory experiences are modes of touch related to tactility. We touch with our eyes. Our contact with the world takes place at the boundary line of the self, if you like, through specialized parts of this enveloping membrane, the skin. You could say it might be our evolution from being amoeba or something. Ashley Montagu, the anthropologist, said, "The skin is the oldest and most sensitive of our organs, our first medium of communication. Even the transparent cornea of the eye is overlain by a layer of modified skin." So there's this sense of the human body in the world with this 180 degrees of vision brings me and my body into the navel of the world, if you like. Not in the sense of the viewing point of the central perspective, which, Renaissance perspective, single point perspective, brings you into, as the human being, into the center of the world. It's not about that being in the viewing point like that, but as the locus of reference, memory, imagination, and integration into the world. So that's really key, again, for a student to start to understand that their senses play into the world and wrap them in and integrate them into the world. They're not there as the viewpoint, the viewing point, the observer. It's really critical. So the integration happens in our imagination, where an object is simultaneously held in the hand and in the head. And the imagined and projected physical image is modelled by our bodies. We are inside and outside of the object at the same time. It's a remarkable factor in the experience of enveloping spatiality, interiority, and hapticity is the deliberate suppression of sharp, focused vision. So you can say this is actually a problem, that how we invest and integrate ourselves with the world is about everything else apart from foveal vision, that experience of knowing where you're going and what you're doing. You might wonder what this is doing on here. This looks like a very scrubby drawing that you might have just binned from a student workshop. It is the most remarkable drawing because what I got students to do in a peripheral drawing workshop, again in a way of tying them up and blinding them and variously putting them through their paces, is that they worked in pairs, and I asked people to bring in objects that they held, they were quite special to them or that they had a connection to, they could hold in their hands. So we set up students who stared at a dot on the wall, and their partner brought the objects to various points in their peripheral vision until they finally arrived at the point of being able to focus on something. So you can see here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, etc. So there's the 6 positions going around that arc of the peripheral vision. So obviously out here, if someone's holding something, in this case I suspect it was a necklace or sort of a bracelet, they can't really see very much, and it gets there and still can't see very much until actually you get very, very close to the point of foveal vision and it just about starts to come into view. So what? I could have probably told you that was going to happen, and you can kind of see the bracelet starting to gradually appear in the student vision in their drawing. If I told you that position number 1 was here, would you be interested? that's holding the object behind the head. And the student is actually able to draw this shape with absolutely any option to draw any shape at all, a square, rectangle, it could be anything. They drew this shape from behind their head. And then when we start to see the object emerging, we arrive at this shape. Now that happened so many times, I'd say it happened around about 70–75% of the time. A student will be able to draw from behind their head what they couldn't see more accurately than in this position, or this position, or this position. Now this was extraordinary to me already, because this is sort of like a bit of action research. But to a student, it was like people walked out of these workshops and they had gone through a kind of an esoteric experience. Imagine finding out that you could draw from behind your head, just from this sense of being in the world and being in the sensorium of the world, and understanding that things are not set in stone and it is possible to do something which doesn't appear to be possible. That got me interested in peripheral vision. This is Exeter Cathedral, by the way. So I'm just think for a moment of walking into a large cathedral space. It's figured like a forest, isn't it, really? You probably noticed that before when you walk into cathedrals. These great pillars, particularly Gothic cathedrals, clearly, have this sort of tree-like forms. You're walking into almost a stone forest glade with dappled light and little silencers and people moving around very quietly. So it is a space that's built for peripheral vision. It seems to depend fundamentally on the nature of peripheral vision, which enfolds the subject in the space. When you're walking into a space like that, you feel entirely held by it. The forest context and that sort of richly moulded architectural space provide this stimulus, the ample stimuli for peripheral vision, and these settings centre us in the very space of what they are as that quiet cathedral space. So the pre-conscious perceptual realm, which is experienced outside of the sphere of focused vision, is just as important existentially to us as the focused image. And there is evidence that peripheral vision has a higher priority in our perceptual and mental system. So we actually take more notice of what happens in our peripheral vision than we do in terms of our foveal vision. As I said, it integrates us with space, while focused vision pushes us out of the space, making us mere spectators. So there's a good quote here from the philosopher David Michael Levine. I think it is appropriate to challenge the ocular centrism of our culture. That ocular centrism, that sort of focus on the focusing. And I think we need to examine very critically the character of vision that predominates today in our world. We urgently need a diagnosis of the psychosocial pathology of seeing and a critical understanding of ourselves as visionary beings. I nearly called this talk Visionary Beings, actually, because that's such a powerful idea that we remember, back to the golden ratio, as visionary beings, have something extraordinary going on, and we are very, as human beings, are so important in the world. The will to power is very strong in vision. There is a strong tendency in vision to grasp and fixate, to reify and totalize, which has assumed a certain uncontested hegemony over our culture and its philosophical discourse, establishing and keeping with the instrumental rationality of our culture and the technological character of our society, an ocular-centric metaphysics of presence. So what he's saying is, this bit is troubling us right now. We're so bound up in the rational gaze that we have left behind this whole range of view. So the growing hegemony of the eye seems to parallel with the development of Western ego consciousness and the gradually increasing separation of the self and the world. So we've pulled ourselves away from the world through this focus on the rational view, the foveal vision. Vision separates us from the world, where the other's senses unite us with it. So Levine set up two ideas. He set up two ideas around vision. One is the assoteric gaze, which is a narrow, dogmatic, rigid and fixed gaze, which is this one, and the alethic gaze, which is associated with multiplicity of standpoints, perspectives, multiple, pluralistic, democratic, contextual, inclusionary and caring, associated with a kind of higher truth. So you could argue, you can see how peripheral vision starts to get us towards this sense of the alethic gaze. Now, our capacity of memory would be impossible without a body memory. We remember through our bodies as much as through our nervous system and brain. I hold memory in my body. I'm sure any of you who've done yoga will understand that when you go into certain yoga positions, all kinds of memories from the past suddenly pop into your mind that you've never thought about not for years and years and years. And they just literally pop out into your waking mind. So we hold memory in our joints, in our arms, in our legs and so forth. And the sense of the body and how the body represents art. A great musician plays himself rather than the instrument, and a skillful soccer player plays the entity of himself and the other players and the internalized and embodied field. So the player understands where the goal is in a way which is lived rather than known. A good player, and you've seen some football matches maybe, a good football player is just in the space of the game. He inhabits, or they inhabit the playing field. The field is inhabited by a knowing body. That sense of being all absolutely at one. It's part of the sense of the alethic gaze. I'm sure sportsmen have to work on their peripheral vision. I know fighter pilots do. Part of who you are as a human being. I'm going to take you into another space now, which is another space of peripheral vision, which is, I'm going to take you to East Anglia and the trauma of the Cold War now. Just hang on to peripheral vision because it still makes sense through this. This is where I ended up with it, actually, as part of my doctoral research. So my childhood in East Anglia, air bases, siren tests, V-bombers, Cold War, major Cold War, in the 70s, common with everybody else in my generation, largely, gives you a certain kind of view of life and death, probably. I think at the point when I got to my doctoral research, I needed to work through some of this stuff. I needed to get over it, catharsis, if you like. So I found out that across the country, it's around 1,500 of Royal Observer Corps bunkers, which are scattered across the country in various sectors. There are some around Plymouth, and there's certainly a lot around in Norfolk. And they were there to monitor potential nuclear bursts and radiation in the event of a nuclear strike on the UK. It looks a bit like some kind of weird pumping station that you just ignore. You've probably seen them, but you just haven't known what they are. That's what they kind of look like. Underground is, you go down these hatches. You can get into them I made a key, you can get in. You go down this hatch. Now, would you go down there if you didn't know what was down there? No. But if you do know what's down there, you will go down. It's about 20 feet down into these little concrete bunkers. That is where the Royal Observer Corps used to go down in the 70s, 80s, all the way up to 92, actually, so reasonably late on, to act as the sensor, if you like, human sensors in the event of nuclear war. So when you get down there, it's pretty, most of them, it's rank. Either the kids are broken in, or it's just been abandoned. Interestingly, one of them I went down into, I found it had some equipment down there to monitor earthquakes, I think, at some point. They'd been doing that. But you get down there and it's bunk beds. Often the only thing that's been left behind is the cleaning materials that they use. So glitto, fantastic in the circumstance of mutually assured destruction. At least you've got your glitto. It's like your soap, your MOD soap and so forth. So seriously though, these are really abject places, like being buried alive really, and they're like little caves with detecting apparatus sticking out of them. And when they were being used, they'd have sensors coming out of them, like bomb pressure indicators, radiation detectors on the surface. So there's another one. This is not my photograph, that's somebody else's, but it's a cleaner one. So you can see on top of this hill, and they've got 360 view around in the landscape. So if there's a nuclear burst on the horizon there, they can see it, triangulate it. There's their sensor sticking out of it. That's the radiation detector. And this is the point I want to make is this other thing. It's there, and it's called the ground zero indicator. And it's like a kind of pinhole camera that sits up there with photographic paper in, like this, it's gridded. So if there's a flash on the horizon of a nuclear device going off, they can say, okay, I'm triangulating that nuclear burst exactly degrees west, whatever it is. And there's a set of other posts who will also be doing that, so they'll be able to tell you they'll be able to work out where it went off. And also whether it was a ground burst or an air burst. It's a kind of allegory, if you like, for us. I mean, talking about being in a sort of repressed state almost. The sense of being underground, being in the black, not being able to see the world, just being reliant on these sensors, these ways of particularly seeing the world. And hilariously, in order to change the film, someone would have to go up the ladder and out to change the photographic film and go back down again. Classic British approach, isn't it? Really, it's like, okay, Bob, it's your turn to go up the ladder. Change the film and nip back down again. Seriously, that was the way it was. They also had telephone lines so they could communicate. So you can often work out where they are. If you see a telephone post going across the field that suddenly stops, you'll find the post there because the line just went down from the post into the ground and into the post. And of course now, what happens in the event of nuclear war is probably the telephone line is not going to survive very long. And that's the siren that would have set off the 4-minute warning and so forth. So back to this bit, this is what really interested me. This idea of a sensor which was looking out on the landscape and would almost have the last view of the English landscape or the British landscape before nuclear Armageddon. But on that, somehow captured on that paper would have been the last view. I'm going to get last view of England, should we say, whatever, last view of the UK. Really, really resonant. And so I set up Super 8 camera and I made a recording and actually, weirdly, Super 8 is 4 minutes long. Did you realise that? It's like we'd had enough time to shoot a Super 8 film before the bomb hit. If you wanted to do that, hear the siren, I know, quick, grab a Super 8 camera. 4 minutes, 240 seconds at cardinal points from these posts. And some of you who were here at the time might remember that show called The Violet Club, which was just over in Mirror over there. The Violet Club is not a kind of club in Plymouth. It's a code name for a nuclear device. So the Violet Club was a NATO code name. So I set up a giant ground zero indicator in Mirror. It took them ages to build that circular. Were you here, Paul, doing that? I can't remember.
I remember it.
Yeah. Real pain to build a circular wall. And so the projectors here, and each of these points were these 4-minute Super 8 films on a loop, which were just projecting out this sense of the last view of England. So that's just as an overview of where I was going with my research. But let's get back to peripheral vision and the drawing. So some drawings that came out of that research led to these very large charcoal drawings, which I call this transition series. This one, transition one, touching, remember, touching and clear. Touching the horizon would have been a ground burst, much more destructive, lots of soil and stuff going up into the air. Clear was when it was an air burst. So I effectively tried then to draw what I thought was in the GZI, what was in the ground zero indicator. That sense of the last view of England, which would have been a negative view. And I'm going to go back to what you might have experienced by looking at the red ball, is that at the edges of your vision, you start to see negative, flashing on and off. Light turns to black, black turns to light. Because one of the really interesting things about peripheral vision is that there's a reversal of contrast. You carry, repressed in your waking life, negative images, which are here all the time. Your brain represses them. So it becomes almost a peripherality, a way of carrying that sense of peripheral vision into something which is the last view of a living world in many ways. Out of interest, that's called the opponent process theory, which is why we get changes of negative images in our peripheral vision, because the cells, they get tired and things move because of your nervous system is overstimulated. There's also something about trauma in this as well, that we carry in our peripheral vision memory because it's familiar. For instance, I know that over there is a bottle and a glass and a table and some people, and I don't really have to concern myself too much. It's about being familiar. So actually what that's saying is that's about memory. I remember about bottles and glasses and tables and chairs and people. I don't have to concern myself with that. But you might think also, where is that memory held? Where do those memories come from? And what kind of memories are they? And when you catch out of the corner of your eye something or somebody that you thought you knew or you remembered, actually, where does that memory come from? Like the body, the mind. Memory sits there as a point, and also traumatic memory as well. So these visions of England, which were profoundly traumatic, remember it went back to my childhood growing up in this stuff, and I was seriously worried about it. I woke up in sunlight coming through the window in my bedroom, not thinking what a nice sunny day. I would be thinking, is that as bright as it would be if a nuclear bomb went off? Seriously, that. I remember thinking that. That's profoundly what I was thinking about. So there's a way you carry trauma in this peripheral vision, which was my interest in my doctoral research about what does that mean, how can we unpack that. So suddenly, using the bunkers and using that kind of as a context for all this suddenly makes sense. If you've ever been around someone who's in a really serious anxiety state, something like depersonalization, for instance, and if you go to the edges of pathology and find out and really look at what happens to people when they get into a really traumatized situation, for instance, soldiers in battle and so forth, that anxiety states and traumatic states have a direct bearing on our visual and spatial awareness. People see differently because they're traumatized. It is absolutely a fact. So there's a real connection between trauma and memory and how we see that is absolute, unquestionably there. I just remember reading a novelist called Ernst Junger, who wrote about the Second World War. He wrote a book called The Glass Bees, which was a cavalryman's experience of being in battle. And the character in the book said the bullets were like glass bees. It doesn't matter. You kind of become disassociated from your visual experience. But loss of memory and depersonalization are extreme examples that provide evidence for the connection between vision and this sort of cognitive state. So there's something, again, that how drawing gets you to that, because drawing has this open. I wasn't going to talk a lot about drawing in this lecture, because it's a vast field, and I could spend a long time talking about drawing. But it sort of hovers there as something which is being referred to. But because drawing has this open state, and this state of being there and not being there, it has the ability to represent something about this sense of memory and trauma, and things being repressed and not being there, things of flashing on and off, and like a figure field switch somehow, which really makes sense to me. It really made sense to me. So these are large section drawings of negative landscapes for the artists amongst you that had to go to a show in Switzerland. So they were 140 by 150 meters. I knew I wasn't going to be able to pay for art moving, So I sectioned them, these are Fabriano paper, and I made a suitcase which I knew would get through security, and made a false bottom in it to put all the Fabriano sheets in so I could get it on the plane and take it to Switzerland. And that's the kind of thing you do if you're trying to avoid a lot of expense. As I said, they're holding that sense of the reversal of polarity, the negative, the trauma of that moment in the 20th century, that short and dangerous century. One book which some students here might remember me always pushing was Anton Ehrensweig's The Hidden Order of Art, which I think is, it's getting on a bit now. It's the 1960s, but still lots of things in there which still need to be negotiated with, if you like. And he described peripheral vision as part of our perceptual field, which is actively repressed by the consciousness. I've just said that. So the peripheral phenomena of distortion are unconsciously omnipresent in everyday perception and are kept from reaching consciousness by a potent resistance. So he described the eye as an allegory of how our consciousness works. We focus on the task at hand, while other half-formed thoughts drift around the outside in readiness to emerge or to disappear forgotten. And we are so the fish in the water, don't ask the fish about the water, but because we're in the bubble of this all the time, we repress most of what we can see and what we know. And in terms of a pedagogy, I go back to that each time, in terms of a student understanding of their place in the world, that is a kind of key moment, if you like, in their formative journey as an artist. So peripheral vision is also populated by memory, as I said, outside, made up of the familiar or the currently unimportant background of intentionality. I'm bringing that back in again because Ehrensweig's great 1960s. We've done other work has happened since then. And we've got Patricia Kane and Alva No as well are talking about ideas of inactive perception, where actually we lay onto the world more than it gives back to us. That Ehrensweig's account is much more of like a world picture. The classic kind of, when you learnt about sight and vision in biology, they probably said something like, yes, the light goes through the eye and it falls there and there's a lens and it falls on the back of the retina and it goes to the brain. So there's like little cinemas on our heads. That's it. We just receive the world. It's called the world picture theory. So someone like Alva No and others describe perception in terms of an inactive process. It's that perceptual memory is not held within the viewer as part of an internal world picture, but rather that the world mediates our active exploration we perceive by what it affords us. So the world, if you like, the world is like a kind of armature. It's like a kind of grey scaffolding through which we project our memory and our sense of self onto it. Already we're going in a whole different direction here, but I just wanted to make that point to you because it's also, I think, running around part of this research is that the world is a store of memory to us. So we hold memory in our bodies, and it's projected out into the world. The Greeks, if you're familiar with it, their diagram of how we see does not have the arrow going this way. It has the arrow going outwards from the human being out into the world, because that's the sense of sight and vision all around us, which we lay onto the armature of the world, and which is more of a two-way process than it is about us receiving the world as a world picture. So peripheral vision is bound up in this sense, this wholeness, this gestalt, if you like, of our sensory and cognitive capabilities. I've struggled with the visualization of peripheral vision, and through the research I did in my doctorate, it's always that sense of, I did lots of experiments trying to capture it by drawing it. So if you tried drawing something without looking at it, or trying to draw something that's out of the corner of your eye, you're trying to make sense of, as soon as your hand, which is also part of your sensorium, also thinks for itself, and if you're an artist, you actually make sense of things by drawing them, I just end up with kind of, drawings of, I hated it. It didn't work. It really didn't. You end up creating, it looked like, I haven't got any examples because I sort of won't look at them anymore. that sense of how you draw something without looking at it was a real problem. So I've always tried to move how I represent peripheral vision into other modes, or translate it into other modes of practice. So here I've translated it through photography into a negative image, and I can show you. So I drew it in a negative. I like this. So if you reverse it, that's the image that lies behind it, but it's not there because I drew it in negative. Through photography and the peripheral image, the image of the idea of it being negative, and that's what's held in our peripheral vision was a way of representing it. So all the way through the PhD research, I was clearly diving in bunkers and hanging out and drawing this kind of stuff. Actually, what I found out by the end, I much preferred talking to the people in the villages and talking to the people who'd been in the crews and actually be engaging with, I suppose, the social aspect of what it meant to have a nuclear bunker above your village and people in it looking out for 40 years for the nuclear burst in shifts variously. I think they went down when there was an alert. It went to a certain level of alert, not all the time. So I started to become interested in, if you like, a more democratic and inclusive and social aspect of this, and how we are writing and drawing and speaking beings, and how this sense of peripherality could also be aligned to our other senses. The question for me was, if there's peripheral vision, is there peripheral hearing? Is there peripheral touch? Is there peripheral taste? There should be, because it's also what we focus on, and in terms of our intentionality, leads you to believe that there must be that sense of the unformed and memory and artifacts that operate in a repressed way around all our sensorium. So back to the theme of the lecture, which is common sense, and hopefully you got that sense that this is about a democratic idea of how we all share this sensorium, how we all share this. We're all participants in this sensory life. My question for me was, how can we really draw on this? And what operates most often? For those of you who are teachers in the room, very clearly we have students come towards us who say, I can't draw. I can't draw. And there's a sort of anxiety around drawing. And often I've said to students, well, you just spoke. You just used language. You gestured already. You're making drawing just by speaking. And this is quite an interesting thing to unpack with a student, because you get into quite an interesting space. So that led me towards an idea of language and speaking as a democratic process, and how we could start to move out into the peripheral nature of language and speaking, which is our everyday. We carry vision, we also carry language and speaking with us as a common everyday activity. We are writing, drawing, speaking beings, pattern-making beings. This is a piece of work from the early 2000s. This is way before. Something that I picked up. If you might have heard of Chladnian figures, and it's a plate, and we have often sand, and you play a note through it through a loudspeaker. The plate vibrates, and the sand takes a particular form. So I made a Chladnian camera. I've got a picture here. So I made it's basically, there's the plate on which are the grounds. Actually, it's like a podium powder. It's a very, very spherical powder, underneath which is your speaker, and through that you play the note. It arranges itself, and then because this is on transparent paper, I could then take that into a dark room and expose it by contact means, just as like a photogram. This is what they are. So these are photograms of the Chladnian figures. Now the thing about this is it's not just any old tone, it's the vowel system. So they're vowels, A, E, I, O, U. With A, I got that. if you play, this is like one of those moments of understanding something. It's like understanding that foolscap is 8 by 13, or understanding that all kinds of things, that the golden ratio exists. It's like, I got an A. And then, okay, so I got, this is an I. But then I was thinking, well, it's very circular, but then there's 2 natural bifurcations in it, like the phi. And you get that, because that, and you can replicate it. So anyway, this is from the early 2000s. So I think there was something there, which was a piece of research which I did, which was really interesting, and started to give me the basis on, well, if we speak, how do we speak and what do we speak? And how do we receive that? And if we think about sound even, how our eardrums receive sound, and not just in the way that our biology teachers told us that the eardrum goes in and out and moves the malleus and the inca and the stapes, and you kind of get this system. That the eardrum is like that, really, and the sound is falling on it in much more of a kind of like a Stadian figure. It's falling on it and giving it and moving it in many different directions, much more sensitively. So that's what gave me a kind of input into always this interest in language and how something might be in the peripherality of how we act in the world. That's a great image, an idophone. Nobody quite knows how she did it, but that's an image of Margaret Watts Hughes's voice, which she used a particular method. It's like there's a whole theory of cymatics and cymatic figures and so forth that produce these regular figures. That's an image of her voice. There's a whole series of things here which I think are interesting around language and voice, which is about how we gesture in the world and the way the pattern of language is derived from the gestures of the body. So my sense of democratizing language and speaking and making that a gesture in the world, like drawing, an indexical trace, if you like, comes from this sense of when we speak and we make the patterns of language in everyday life, that there's a form there which we use, if you like, from our early childhood. The development of children from movement to gesture to speech, and from speech to thinking. And this way that we grow into the human village, if you like, and the kind of the acculturated into the human village is around this development, this metamorphosis. I've often thought about why we say things around the right way, and actually, when in naming things, I thought a lot about my daughter's name. We thought a lot about my daughter's name, so that when her name falls on the front of your mouth, when you go to the surname, it naturally falls into the same place. So you can say things evenly. And that's why people have good names, because often they have pitter-patter names or drib-drab names, because that's the way your mouth normally falls. So drawing as well has the ability to give that sense of the concatenation of words and pauses in our speaking, where we, as Avis Newman says, we experience unconscious emotions in a repetition and accumulation of marks like language, and drawing is a language in the same way that we speak. But it is a great thing to understand as a young person, or even someone who's anxious about drawing, that making a conversation in a room is as valid an art activity, and actually you're almost creating a third thing. When you're speaking to people and when you're in a conversation, it's almost like the conversation hovers in front of you in the space, and you add into it. And the participants in the conversation are making an art piece that has an indexical trace. They're making a trace, not only in the minds of their own memories of the conversation, but they're making a trace. And this is where we're coming back to the peripherality of vision and the peripherality of the senses here. They're making a trace which hangs in the world. Energy is neither created nor destroyed. Every vibration, every sound hangs in the room, in the body. Every sound masks an entire history of sound, a cacophony of silence. So I think this is the point, really, which really connects peripheral vision, memory, and the residues of language and sound. And it's a signpost towards how we might trap the elusiveness of peripheral vision through language, drawing, writing, to translate between the modes of the senses. Remember, I've always had trouble with how we can express peripheral vision, and I'm always looking for modes of translation, ways of moving it into other modes of expression. So Stephen Scrivener has said, to help the mind do different things. It's what that sense of drawing has got these indeterminacies, which can translate between different kinds of thinking, between kinds of thinking which are to do with conventions, more word-like thinking, and kinds of thinking which are to do with iconic, how things mimic structures and physical space. So drawing has those modes of, I can represent a building, but I can also be indeterminate and be slip between modes. One piece of my research I did in Ashburton Art Space a couple of years ago. I set up a communal meal, an open discussion. Now the event itself was what you might expect in a community centre, not a conversation. Now, the difference for me is that I had observers posted in the space with little sand timers with to measure the time that they listened to a conversation, and when the sand timer ran out, they would take the last word that they heard and make a note of it in the conversation. So effectively they were scoring the conversation. They were recorded at 1 minute intervals by volunteers who were timing them with sand clocks. So this is the kind of, there was a vast wall in the chapel full of words that could have been could have been any word that hung in the air when the sand clock ran out. And then they were noted down and redacted. So 4 words heard simultaneously by listeners recording words at 1 minute intervals in a 2-hour conversation. An experience of peripherality, an experience of words that hang in the air, that are at the edges, that have been taken out of their kind of meaning, if you like, into this sort of sense of being asemic, an asemic text, asemic writing as a wordless, open, semantic form of writing, to have no specific semantic content. But what you're doing now is trying to read those words. I know. You're going, I wonder what that word is. Well, I bet that's any, or because you're reading the net of the word and trying to understand what it is, but your mind is reaching out and seeking for meaning in what those shapes are, because you know they're words. But it's entirely it's utterly obliterated by being redacted, so they're making the net. So it's up to you to decide how to translate and explore that, but it's also an experience. Again, remember I've shifted peripheral vision into different modes in all the way through my research. This is another way of expressing that sense of, okay, I'm in this space and I'm pressing outwards, trying to find meaning in memory and in half-seen things. So it becomes less an analysis of the conversation, rather a drawing of the conversation based on the forms of the word that open up a connection to the speaking gesture. So I think this one's going to be in the show. So this is a 26-minute conversation, audio art, so it's William Furlong's audio art. So this is a conversation with Joseph Boyce and William Furlong in 1983. So I did this one using, back to the golden ratio. This one is recorded at 1 minute intervals, and this one was recorded at 1 minute 37 seconds intervals, which that's the golden ratio in terms of time. So I took the words out at those particular times to create 2 forms of text that relate to each other through the golden mean. So the last piece, this is this is me on Dartmoor, thinking about language and writing and notating. And so I'm sitting on Dartmoor with my eyes fixed on the horizon at a particular point, doing what you just did with the red ball for quite a long time, watching the landscape change and pulsate and lightning flashes moving across it. There we are. The sudden sense of being able to see the whole landscape all at once, of really being suddenly holding your vision open, understanding or seeing rocks and parts of the landscape almost kind of erupting in utter clarity. And this is not a kind of a mystical experience. This is accessible to everybody. But if you do that, then your peripheral vision supplies you with this other vision. Again, how do you draw it? It's kind of not drawable. So translating it into language and writing the the impressions effectively with my right and left hand, pushing it out, the arc of the body, peripheral vision, and translating that mode into another way of doing it apart from representational drawing. To conclude, telling a different story about our senses to people, to students, to affect how we see, how our whole being cleaves towards another kind of seeing. It's common to talk about, commonplace to talk about the rigidity and narrowness of our screen-based vision. We talk a lot about children and being short-sighted because of screen use. We have, we all have glasses now as a cultural norm. We look at 4:3 ratio screens. Here's one. Can you see how different this is to the satisfying kind of foolscap blackboard? We look at these 4:3 screens. We have the golden ratio in photography is now the rule of thirds because it's near enough, isn't it? The rule of thirds, that gets it, doesn't it? It does not get it. I mean, it absolutely does not get it. We've been trammelled, if you like, into a particular, quite narrow focus. And the speed of development of our extensions to our sensors, which is effectively our technologies, everything we have around us from cameras to smartphones to the whole thing, is basically to artificially extend our sensors out through our own devices. And I think we, if not face a tipping point or are well past the tipping point and go rapidly running down the other side of the hill, a space where technology and automation is increasingly made to imitate even closer human interactions through AI and through the developments there. There was a terrifying moment when I understood that a little girl was missing from her class, and so the teacher put a robot on the desk instead, and that was the little girl, and the robot was able to sort of take the teacher's instruction, and that sort of replaced the child in the class for that moment when she was missing for a couple of days. So there's a sort of sense in which we're ever closer human interactions, and the replacement of that, the real of our environment, is happening all around us. And I'm, in many ways, I welcome that because it's also part of how we are developing as human beings. So this is not a kind of a way of sort of resisting that somehow. It's going to happen. What I'm trying to say here is that there is another story which I think that we have to continuously remember for ourselves, that there's all of this is still going on. We are still the human beings. We are still, if you like, the divine human ratio and expression in the world. And technology only gets us so far. Our use of language, our vision is far more than we realise. Just want to finish now with a quote from Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, a French priest and scientist, who said, "We're not human beings having a spiritual experience. We're spiritual beings having a human experience." And I think we need to remember that as we move into this ever-increasing complexity of AI and digitality. And I'm also going to leave Boyce with the last word there. Okay, thank you very much, everybody, for your patience and